we're back. Okay, I'm actually gonna take this off because it is ridiculously hot in here. Oh yeah, that's better. Okay, it is quite literally 90 degrees in my apartment, so this jacket was not long for this video, but it is one of my favorite things that I own, and I'll take any excuse to wear it. We're gonna spice it up in here. It's gonna be crazy. It's actually not gonna be crazy at all. You know exactly what you're getting. This is part 2 of recommending books to F1 drivers. Very excited to be here. Thank you for joining me. Driver number 1 today is, as I like to call him, the pretty boy of F1. If you're looking for an Instagram feed with lots of six-packs, lots of shirtless selfies, lots of water and boats, maybe a little bit of Taylor Swift in there, George Russell is your guy. Now, he has a famously well-tailored Instagram. He loves taking a shirtless selfie. He's also quite wonderful. I think he seems to be really good friends with Alex Albon, and him, Alex, and Lando kind of went up through the ranks of junior karting together. Generally, he's a very clean, fair racer from Britain. He started his F1 career at Williams and then took the seat next to Lewis Hamilton at Mercedes, where he still is. And yeah, he's just like a very classy, good dude. But the thing that I think about when I think of George is truly his Instagram feed, because he's literally across the paddock even, just famous for the number of shirtless selfies that he takes. So when I was thinking about a book that George would like to read, I was actually not thinking about a book he'd want to read. I was thinking about a book he would want to post onto his Instagram feed. What is a book that is pretty enough to exist next to his six-packs and would make him look like a hot girl? And for that, I chose Slow Days, Fast Company by Eve Babbitt. When I think of Eve Babbitt as an author, I think of her similarly to Joan Didion in that their books are the kinds of books I could imagine, you know, like models reading by the pool. Something about the books make you seem intellectual, but are also actually quite intellectual while still being somewhat accessible and fun. And there's just like a hot girl summer energy to Eve Babbitt's novels. And Slow Days, Fast Company is like hot girl summer personified. This book takes place in the 1960s in LA, and it's kind of pseudo or semi-autobiographical, describing a lot of Eve Babbitt's experiences in LA, kind of around fame and around the LA Hollywood scene. This book is beautiful, and I think that if George were to post a selfie where he was, you know, reading this book by the beach, shirtless, water, sand, it would fit the vibe well. And I think that if he were to read a book, it would be a book that would fit well into his Instagram feed, which is why I think this is a good rec for him. Up next, we're gonna talk about one of the most beloved drivers on the grid, both in terms of fans' love and also in terms of, honestly, drivers' love, and that is Carlos Sainz. Now, Carlos Sainz has jumped around between a lot of teams in F1. He was a Red Bull junior driver, so he drove on Toro Rosso for a while. He was at Renault for a bit. He was at McLaren with Lando Norris for a bit, and now he's at Ferrari, but starting next season, he's going to be at Williams. The sense I get from Carlos is that he really can just get along with anybody. Like, put him next to Lando, Lando is this iconic best friend duo. Put him next to Charles, C-Squared is hilarious and funny, and they seem to really love each other and appreciate each other. And I think that Carlos just seems like the type of driver who can get along with nearly anybody and just has like a very good, brotherly, good energy about him. I just think of Carlos as having good forward thinking and just being able to get along with a lot of different people. And for this reason, I decided that he would enjoy the book The People Immortal by Vasily Grossman. The People Immortal was written in the 1960s, I believe, but it takes place in 1942, right as Germany is invading Russia. It follows different military groups within Russia as they're fighting off this initial German invasion. And there's just throughout the novel this sense of deep camaraderie and love and respect for each other, and they're all just fighting to defend their homeland, right? At the time, Russia had been invaded by Germany and were fighting against the Nazis, and so there was this really strong air of justice, and then also this sense of like, you cannot take our home away. And so there's all these men who are fighting who aren't really soldiers or warriors, they're philosophers, they're musicians, but they all have these really beautiful dynamics with one another and all deeply believe in protecting and defending their homeland. I think of this book as having a combination of this brothers in arms, brotherly love, and also this like forward thinking strategy side of like military tactics. And I think because Carlos is such a good strategian, he's a good strategic thinker. And because of that, I think he would appreciate some of like the military strategy side of things, but then also really resonate with this like brothers in arms, brotherly love side of the book as well. This next one is a little bit out of pocket, but I thought of it and I thought it was funny, so I'm sorry in advance. But I'm actually going to recommend the same book to two different drivers because I think that they would benefit from buddy reading it. And the two drivers are our two current Alpine drivers, Esteban Ocon and Pierre Gasly. So if you don't know the lore behind the Esteban-Pierre feud, as far as I can tell from the internet, Pierre was dating a girl, and then Esteban came in and kind of did like a Mr. Steal Your Girl move and took Pierre's girlfriend. But this happened like years and years ago, and then they both became drivers at Alpine, and it seemed like Alpine was trying really hard to get Esteban and Pierre to like connect and be friends so they didn't fight each other too much on track and cause a bunch of collisions. But it seems to me that there's still some beef there because when Charles, who's Pierre's best friend, posted pictures of an outing that Esteban, Pierre, and Charles all went on, he cropped Esteban out of literally every single picture. But Pierre and Esteban, because of their PR teams at Alpine, had to put all three of them in the picture together. So we have the versions of the pictures that are all three of them together, but Charles on his Instagram literally cropped Esteban out of every single one. And so to me, it seems like there kind of is a feud between Pierre and Esteban, but I don't know if it's like there's kind of two sides to the story and they need to learn to put their differences aside and work together. And so for this reason, I feel like they would benefit from reading together A Visit from the Goon Squad by Jennifer Egan. Now this book, first of all, is really cool. I liked it a lot, but the main reason I would recommend it to Esteban and Pierre is because it's this sort of short story anthology, but all the stories are interconnected, and we follow the same characters across the stories, but from different characters' points of view. So in the first story, we're following Sasha, then we're following her boss, and then we're following her boss's wife, and then that person's children, and like there's all these different interconnected stories. And I think what I really took away from the book while I was reading it is how different each person's perspective is. How you perceive the world and what you're doing can feel like your only option or can feel like the right thing, even if externally it looks unforgivable or it comes across very differently. And so I think it's a good book for understanding different perspectives of the same situation. And I think reading it together and discussing it would maybe bring them together a little bit. Although they're not going to be on the same team after this year since Esteban Ocon is going to Haas. But at least for the remainder of the season, maybe it would benefit them to have this communal reading experience. Up next, we've got Mr. Valtteri Bottas. Now, Valtteri, honestly, I feel a little bit bad for. He was the number 2 driver at Mercedes for a long, long time, pretty much throughout the majority of Mercedes's dominance, where Lewis Hamilton won the majority of his F1 drivers' championships. But Valtteri was never as good as Lewis, and that was obvious. However, he was still in his own right an excellent driver. Now he's been kind of relegated to being at a much worse team, while Lewis obviously is still at Mercedes and then is going on to Ferrari. And I do feel for Valtteri because he was never a bad driver, he just is not the greatest driver of all time, and that's who he was compared to. So I feel like Valtteri would maybe benefit from a reminder that just because you are not the absolute pinnacle, not the absolute best, doesn't mean you're not good and worthy of respect and worthy of appreciation. And so for that reason, I wanted to choose a book that was kind of part of an author's backlog. So rather than being an author's most famous book, I wanted a book that was still good but was not talked about nearly as often. And because of that, I chose I Am by Maggie O'Farrell. So Maggie O'Farrell wrote Hamnet, which got super famous, and The Marriage Portrait, which also got super famous and was nominated for a bunch of awards, and Maggie O'Farrell became very well known in the literary fiction space because of those two books. I Am is her memoir, actually, and I've heard very few people talk about it, but honestly, I really, really enjoyed that book. It's actually told rather than just about like a specific moment in her life. It's told through each of her body parts that at some point had some experience with death. It's all these different near-death experiences that Maggie O'Farrell has had, but told in this really lyrical and literary way, even though it's a memoir. So I really enjoyed this. I thought some near-death experiences were a little more impactful than others, but she has kind of across the board had some really remarkable life experiences. I really love this book, and I think reading it would remind Valtteri that just because he's not Hamnet doesn't mean he's not good and worth reading. Our next driver on the grid has been around the block. been around the track many a time, some might say, and that is Fernando Alonso. Alonso is the oldest driver on the grid. He's been a driver for 20-something years, I want to say, maybe longer. Now, back in the day, Alonso was kind of a dirty dog. Like, there's this famous scandal between him and Lewis Hamilton when they were both at McLaren, where Alonso basically, despite him and Hamilton being teammates, made a pit stop last longer to mess up Hamilton's qualifying. It's kind of one of those things that is sort of tame if you think about how drivers used to be back in the day, but in today's version of racing, which is just much cleaner and sportsmanlike, I think it just would not ever go over well. These days, there's, maybe a little bit of discourse about, he's old, but he still got it. He's not necessarily quite as sharp-elbowed as he was back in the day. But for him, I thought he would like reading a book about people who maybe are not in their technical prime, but are still able to really bring the fight to the younger people. So for that reason, I chose Killers of a Certain Age by Deanna Raybourn. This book was honestly a lot of fun. It follows these 4 older women who were basically all spies together when they were young. And now they're all retired and they're sent on this vacation all together as like a thank you from the company that they used to work for. But then they realize that somebody from the company is trying to kill them off. So that leads them to kind of picking up their old assassin spy skills once again and try to figure out who is it that's trying to kill them and why and what they can do to try to protect themselves. This book was, like I said, a lot of fun. And it also just, I think, really falls into that niche of just because you're older doesn't mean you can't still be successful and talented, and just because you are part of the old guard or follow the old ways doesn't mean that everything that's new is always strictly better. Next, let's talk about Kevin Magnussen. So Kevin Magnussen is interesting. He is currently a Haas driver, but it's unclear if he's going to have a seat in 2025. It's looking like maybe he won't. Kevin Magnussen this season has kind of famously accrued penalty points in doing things that actually benefit his team and benefit his teammate. So he's been driving kind of dangerously or breaking some rules, but it's in the name of the greater good for Haas and for Nico Hülkenberg, his teammate. And so I feel like Kevin Magnussen would appreciate a book that has kind of like a morally gray character or looks into what it means to be a good person, because on the one hand, Kevin Magnussen is breaking a lot of rules and accruing penalty points, and the reason these penalties exist is because it's unsafe driving or, not fair. But on the other hand, he's like doing what he needs to do for the good of his team, and he's not necessarily always putting people in danger or doing anything crazy bad, but it's like bad enough that he had to be banned from racing in one of the races. So kind of with all that in mind, I thought Kevin Magnussen would like reading The School for Good Mothers by Jessamine Chan. This book follows a woman who is trying really hard to be a good mother and loves her kid a lot, but is just going through a lot and ends up doing some things that are not necessarily representative of good parenting. It takes place in this world where there's this almost big brother-like surveillance over parents to make sure that they're doing a good job and taking care of their children well. And because of some slip-ups that our protagonist has, she ends up getting sent to this school for good mothers, which is basically like, how when you're driving, if you accrue enough points on your license, they'll revoke your license, and if you go to some sort of like driver training, you have the chance to get your license back. It's basically the same thing, but they take your child away and you have a chance to get custody back of your child if you can pass this school and if you can do well. But the whole thing is very dystopian and creepy, and I think it really calls into question what it means to be a good parent, whether parents should be allowed to make mistakes and what kind of mistakes they should be allowed to make. And in theory, the government has good intentions in that they want to make sure kids aren't being abused, but at what point is the bar unrealistic, and how does the bar look different for mothers versus fathers? And it follows the protagonist's experience in this school, but then also this court case where she's trying to fight for the rights to custody for her child again. And I think Kevin Magnussen would like this sort of dynamic between what it means to be good by the rules versus good in general, and what does it actually mean to be good at something or a good person. Up next, we've got Zhou Guanyu. Now, Zhou Guanyu is a Chinese driver. He drives for Kick Sauber, and like Kevin Magnussen, it's unclear whether or not he's going to have a seat on the grid next year, but he's, not a super strong personality. I don't think there's anybody who really strongly dislikes him as far as fans go. And it's really emotional and moving to see how much pride he feels about his Chinese heritage. And when they go back for the Grand Prix in China, he gets like a standing ovation. The fans love him so much. It's really wonderful. And he had to leave China pretty early to go to London to become an F1 driver. You can tell when you see interviews with him that he has so much pride and patriotism in his country and in where he's from and in representing them, but he also has so many parts of him that feel very European and Western because of how much of his life he's now spent in Europe, and Formula One by definition is just so Eurocentric. And I think all of these things working together make me think that he would really appreciate reading Babel by R.F. Kuang. Babel follows this young Chinese boy named Robin Swift, and basically his parents die and he's in Canton, and he gets picked up by this professor at Oxford and taken to Oxford to become a student. And the reason for that is this world exists with a magic system that is based on translation and on translating words to other words to harness the power in the intricacy of how translations can be slightly wrong, basically. Because of the way the magic system works, people who natively speak certain languages end up having a bit more power because they understand and speak that language in a more true way. And so the whole thing is like an allegory for colonialism and how, Western countries were taking people and goods and skills from India, China, all these different countries, and using it to prop up their own economies and tear these other countries down. And I think this journey is obviously not the exact same for Zhou Guanyu, but is sort of similar in that he's had to sacrifice so much of his Chinese identity, and despite having so much love for China, had to leave at a young age to come to London. And in a lot of ways, F1 and racing and stuff is benefiting from his sponsorships and support in China and kind of using that. And so I think that he would really empathize with and relate to the protagonist of Babel, despite the fact that obviously it's not exactly the same. I think there are enough similarities there that he would see himself in the protagonist and really resonate with the book. Folks, we have come to our final driver. But this is such a clear example of last but not least, because the last driver I'm going to talk to you about is Daniel Ricciardo. Oh, Danny Rick, what a gem. I'm filming this as the news of the fact that Daniel Ricciardo is no longer going to be an F1 driver from now on and is no longer on the grid has basically been broken for about a week or so. And my heart just goes out to him. If you guys didn't see, in his last interviews after the Singapore Grand Prix, I think, he just is so heartbroken and he's like holding back tears when they're asking about his future in F1. And I just feel so much for him. He's been such a strong driver for so long, but in the last few years has really just not been quite as strong. And despite dedicating so much of his life to F1 and so much of his time, he's never been a driver's champion. He's won many races, but never been a champion. His career has really just kind of come to its end. And he's so funny and lovable, and everyone on the grid loves him and is friends with him. And it's just a little bit heartbreaking. But for this reason, I think Danny would really benefit from reading Carrie Soto is Back by Taylor Jenkins Reid. Carrie Soto is Back follows Carrie Soto, who's this really, really famous tennis player who's recently retired from tennis. She's 37 years old, but she was so incredible throughout her career and eventually just had to give it up. But then there's this new tennis player in the mix, Nikki Chan, who seems to be coming close to breaking Carrie Soto's records. And so Carrie Soto decides to come back for one more season to try to protect and defend her records against this young new hotshot, Nikki Chan. I think the progression of the book could help or be cathartic for somebody who's coming to terms with the fact that their time in a sport that they've given so much to and that they've done so well in is coming to an end. I think there's a lot of catharsis to be had there for Danny. I think it'll help turn that just deep, deep sadness into a melancholy and a nostalgia, but ultimately allow him to still feel the amount of pride he should feel for his career without feeling like he failed or like he let himself down in any way. Oh, okay, I gotta shake off the melancholy. That brings us to the end of the video. Thank you so much for coming along on this journey. I really appreciate how many people seemed to fall into the same F1 and book niche. I didn't think there was that many of us. Turns out there are, which is very validating and cool to see. And if you have any hot F1 takes, I would love it if you would toss it in the comments, because I have some more ideas for F1 book videos that I want to make. And so if you toss your hot takes in the comments, I may use it for a video eventually. Besides that, Thank you for coming along on the journey, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.